It's April 16th, 2026 in northern Colorado. And now it's April 17th, 2026. Our springs are always kind of like this, but this spring has been especially like this, where it's just mostly hot and windy, but then occasionally we actually get our snowiest and coldest days of the year. Now, my experience of seasons in this part of the world is going to be pretty different from the experience of seasons in Northern Europe. But the way that different languages classify the seasons of the year actually varies a fair amount from language to language. In the same way that different human beings can tell the difference between different colors, different kinds of reds and different kinds of greens, but they may not have specific words for those different shades. Something that I've referred to as the semantic taxonomy of color. There's a semantic taxonomy of seasons, right? We can all tell when it's snowing or when it's hot or when it's windy, but how do we talk about the times of year when it is those things? Well, English talks about 4 seasons, which owes a lot to the classical Latin tradition of 4 seasons. But in Old Norse as well as Old English, there are fundamentally 2 seasons, a summer and a winter. So you might notice if you read Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, when he's talking about the story of the smith building the wall around Asgard where the gods live. Then a smith came and offered to make them a wall in 3 seasons, misserum. He would have what he asked for if he could make the wall in 1 winter. But on the first day of summer, if some part of it were unmade, then the deal would be off. He began to build the wall on the first day of winter, but when there were 3 days until summer, he had built quite a bit of the gate for the wall. So he had completed the wall up to the point that he was already building the gate. So reading that, you may notice that Snorri is talking about summer and winter as the only 2 interchanging parts of the year, right? He's going to do this in 3 seasons. The gods bargain him down to where he'll do it in only 1 season, 1 winter, and he's working on it the entire winter until the first day of summer. Now that doesn't make sense from our 4-season model, right? In English we talk about the spring, summer, autumn or fall, and winter. And in Scandinavian languages today, it's the same way. You talk about the vår or forår, the sommar, the höst, and the vinter. But these 4 seasons are influenced by the Latin model because in classical Latin learning, there are 4 seasons that begin with the equinoxes and the solstices, right? And so today, when we talk about astronomical spring, summer, fall, winter, we're talking about those seasons. And when you look up spring or summer or fall or winter in the dictionary, probably that's the first definition you're going to see, right? The season that begins on an equinox or a solstice. But interestingly, those astronomical definitions of those 4 seasons don't correspond very well even to what English speakers normally talk about, right? Because when I say I'll see you in the winter, what people hear from that is not typically like, I'm going to see you in early March. They might think, though, that I'll see you in early December, which is astronomically still fall, right? We have kind of a sense of like what months are winter and what months are spring. There's a sign on the outside of a store that I pass all the time in Masonville, Colorado that says, we open in spring or see you in spring, something like that. And I always think about that because, here it is late April and they're still not open. It's like, I know what they mean, but if they were talking about astronomical spring, they would have been open a month ago. What they mean is we'll be open when it is, routinely spring weather, right? Like May on a lot of years, although they could have opened in January of this year. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind with this stuff too is that if you're looking up words in an Old Norse dictionary or an Old English dictionary, you're going to be looking up words that are used both in native literature, stuff like the Eddic poems or Beowulf, that originates in the local culture, that isn't too influenced by liturgical learning, right? Priests who have learned Latin and reading the Bible and reading classical literature. But then you're also going to be reading words that are used in particular ways in that learned liturgical literature, right? So there are sort of two coexisting systems. There is the older system where summer is half the year and winter is half the year. And then there's this newer system that's being imported by analogy with the Latin system, where we have a year broken up into 4 equal parts, that spring, summer, fall, and winter, and they coexist, just as we kind of have this coexisting sense of what spring, summer, fall, and winter mean in English between astronomical definitions and kind of like weather-based definitions. Okay, so Earl R. Anderson wrote quite a bit about this in the 90s, talking about Old English, and he points out that when in Old English sources they get into the 4 seasons, it's always in a really didactic way. It's as if the person explaining this is spring, this is summer, this is fall, this is winter is talking to an audience that doesn't know what he's talking about. Whereas in, more colloquial, not colloquial exactly, but more native poetic sources, Beowulf or the Seafarer, for example, summer alternates with winter and there's no talk about the spring and fall thing. Consider how Beowulf has this little passage, and there's also something interesting going on with the word year here. Until another year came into the yards, as it still does when it always visits the hall, the wonder bright weather. Then the winter was shaken off, and the earth's embrace was fairer. So an interesting thing that's happening there is the word year is actually being used to mean summer as opposed to winter. So that itself is kind of an interesting definitional issue. But also, right, it's that year, that summer is alternating with a winter. We're not talking about spring coming in, but rather this duality between winter and summer. The same thing in the Seafarer, where we hear that the seafarer endures a hard winter until the Yayak singeth Sumerus Weird, the cuckoo sings, the guardian of summer. So winter and summer, whichever exact word is being used for winter and summer, are 2 things that alternate without things between them. In a similar way, in the Old Icelandic rune poem, we hear about the rune Or, the year, but in an older sense, the part of the year that's not winter, it's not frozen, and how it is Gumnagodi och gott sommar och allgrown acker. It's a good thing for men and a good summer and a fully grown acre. So what it looks like is, at the earliest level, Germanic languages alternate between a part of the year that's winter and a part of the year that's not. Now, what are the origins of these different terms, year and winter and summer? When are these different parts of the year? And what can we say about how old some of these terms are? Let's talk about that in just a moment. Let me remind you that if you enjoy this channel and you want to support it, of course, there's Patreon. Of course, there's my books, which you can get signed copies if you're in the USA, Canada, or Australia from Boulder Bookstore. You can also support this channel by going to grimfrost.com, and my good buddies there will ship stuff anywhere in the world, and they are still, as of April 2026, eating all US import taxes and tariffs. So you can get my books there, you can get cool reproduction Viking stuff there, and they really do care about getting stuff right, including getting runes right. So check them out. It does help the channel, and tell them where you came from. All right, so these different words. I am not trying to say, by the way, that Old Norse or Old English doesn't have a way to talk about spring or fall, doesn't have a word for spring or fall. This is, again, getting back to what I said at the very beginning, a semantic taxonomy thing. Just like in Old Norse, I can describe yellow to you without having a basic category for color that is yellow, because it's not a basic category, it's included in the bigger red category. I can describe spring and fall to you, but spring is the beginning of summer and fall is the end of summer, right? They are still, they're part of a bigger category, which is that summer category. Now, these different words. Summer probably comes from a ancient word for season, which we see, for example, in Vedic Sanskrit, sama, which means, just like in Old Norse, the half-year season, right? The alternating dry and wet parts of the year. Old Irish sav, which means summer. Welsh hav, S's become H's in Welsh for the most part, meaning summer. This is actually probably related to the prefix that we know from Latin semi, Greek hemi, another language where S's become H's usually, certainly beginning of words, which means half. So it's the half of the year, right? So summer, originally half of the year. Winter, in Germanic languages, we have, for example, Gothic winters. We have Old West Norse vetter, which becomes Icelandic vetur, but that has an N elsewhere in North and West Germanic, right? So we actually do see, for example, Old Swedish vinter, which becomes modern Swedish vinter. Something similar is going to become, Danish vinter, Norwegian winter, and then of course, German winter, English winter, Dutch winter, etc. This clearly it's all the same word, all closely related, and I believe probably actually related to the word wind. You'll sometimes see, it's getting too hot. Sometimes see this explained as wet, but I don't know where the end comes from if this is related to the word wet. I think this is the windy part of the year, which makes a ton of sense to me in this part of the world because, of course, it's windy as hell and has been for months, and that's why 50% of what anybody says about these videos, they hate the background noise. But not much I can do about it. So if you have the half of the year and then the windy half of the year, where does the word for year come from? A year, a little hard to say exactly what the ultimate root is, but of course we do see related words in all the different Germanic languages. There's Gothic year, Old Norse or, Old English year. All these are probably actually related to something that shows up in Old Church Slavic is jar, which means spring. So it's clearly something to do with alternation of the seasons. And that one use in Beowulf, that one use in the Old Icelandic rune poem kind of points to the word year maybe once having meant not the entire 12 month astronomical year, but rather the part of the year that's not winter. Spring, so actually that word is not the old word in English. Lent is the old word in English. It's the time of year when the days are lengthening. Lent is ultimately related to length and long. The really interesting word for that is the word that's used in Scandinavian languages. So for example, Old Norse vor. In fact, just based on where it occurs, the verb vora, to become spring, seems to be somewhat older than the noun. And that's related to an old Indo-European root for warm. This is the time of year when it gets warmer. It makes sense, right? And it's very, very common around the Indo-European language family in words for spring. So it's cognate with, for example, ancient Greek eir, which means spring, Persian bahar, which means spring, classical Latin ver, which means spring, like vernal, Old Irish arach, which means spring. So this word is quite old. Again, reinforcing that it's not that the concept of spring isn't old, it's that it's not one of the fundamental units of the year. And then autumn, of course, the English word is borrowed from the Latin autumnus. Interestingly, Chaucer still feels like he has to explain what this means. There's a note in Chaucer where he says, where did I write this down? Autumn, that is to say, in the last end of summer. Reading that in modern English pronunciation, obviously. So he still expects his Middle English audience in the 1300s not to know what this means. But the usual word in Old Germanic languages is harvest, right? Harvest in Old English, host in Old Norse. It's going to be modern Icelandic höst, höst and related things on the continent, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish. Which again, not that they didn't have a way to talk about, it's just that this isn't originally one of the 4 fundamental divisions of the year. There's originally 2 fundamental divisions of the year. And you can see how often summer and winter come up in poetry, right? In Voluspa, you hear about how it's going to be awful of summer efter, during the summers afterward, or in Vafthrut Small, the questions about hvaðan vetur kom eða varmt sumar, from where the winter came, or the warm summer. But as Iceland becomes more learned in, Latin classical learning, we start to see explanations, especially in homilies, like in one of our oldest manuscripts in Icelandic, the Stockholm or Icelandic homily book, where we get that explanation of what those 4 seasons are. And again, this is related to classical learning. It kind of presumes the audience doesn't necessarily understand what these are, or understand these as 4 fundamental units of the year. For example, in the Stockholm homily book, Vor merker usku ora, Sumar merker fulltida alder, Haust merker illi, Vetter merker urvasa alder. So spring marks our youth, summer marks our full-grown age, autumn harvest marks old age, winter marks our worn-out age. So there's 2 old ages. There's just a plain one, and there's a totally worn-out one. But that's, again, building on a later concept that's influenced by Latin classical learning. Earlier, I believe, based on the way that the word misseri, that season word, meaning those 6-month seasons, are used in poetry, that's the fundamental unit of the year, right? In Beowulf, if somebody's old, they're full of misseri. If somebody waits a long time in an old poem in the Poetic Edda, like Havamal or Gudrun the One, they're waiting for misseri. Well, what does that word mean? Miss is probably related to this old Indo-European root half, and then eri, I believe, is a worn down form of the same root that's in year. It's derived from year, right? It's the half year. I think that etymology is supported by this word halleri, which is used by Oyvinder Skaldespiller in the late 900s. It means like the slipping of the year, the falling of the year, sloping of the year. It means famine, or in modern Icelandic, it also is like an economic depression, a time when things are lacking. That has that full vowel er, because it's probably a somewhat more recently made compound in his time. Misseri is an older compound where that vowel has had longer to shorten, and does shorten to e in Old Icelandic. And we do see a and sometimes even o in a u-mutated context in old manuscripts in that second vowel, which points to, again, probably that this is actually coming from or, year. So it's the half year. The fact that year can also sometimes mean summer, I don't think contradicts that. There's also the very interesting fact that both Danish and Dutch call the spring the early year, right? The voror in Danish could also be early summer in an old sense, right? It's not just the early part of the year, but the early part of the summer, i.e. the non-winter part of the year. So, long and the short of it, yes, in Old Norse or Old English or any of these old Germanic languages, you can talk about 4 seasons that are equivalent to our spring, summer, winter, and fall in both astronomical and colloquial senses. But that's being imported from the learned classical culture that they're getting from Christian writing. The earlier division of the year is into 2 basic units, winter and summer. And summer may actually alternate with year in some early texts, where year means the part of the year that's not winter. But each one of those, the winter and the other part, is a misseri, or half year. And these are all very old words, and they reflect the way that the year can be sort of classified into 2 units, a windy part and the part that's not so windy, when you can pursue more of your agricultural activities. And that makes sense for Colorado too, except that we alternate sometimes pretty rapidly between them and have less of that, well, more of the wind and less of the snow than we once did. By the way, when does summer begin? When does winter begin? The traditional Icelandic definition has summer begin in late April and winter in late October, so I'm actually posting this almost at the beginning of summer, and I'm wishing you, of course, during your summer or year from beautiful Colorado, all the best.